please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I'm a third-year student. I'm majoring in CHID as well as Scandinavian Studies, and then minoring in Theater Studies and Swedish. And I'm here to talk about the focus group that I'm going to facilitate next fall.
Well, tell us about your focus group.
Yeah, so the focus group is called Queerness in the Failed, kind of in quotes, coming-of-age narrative. And it's going to take a look at 4 different narratives in different modes about the failure to adhere to norms and thus come of age in a traditional sense because of queerness, as well as other character traits and things like trauma, mental health, capitalism.
And which films in particular are you looking at?
Yeah, so the film we're looking at is Mysterious Skin, which is directed by Greg Araki, and it's based on a novel by Scott Heim, which I think will be optional reading, as I don't want to make people read a novel for a 2-credit class, but it is very good.
Yeah.
And that looks at 2 young men, I think they're 19, who are kind of becoming adults after going through sexual abuse in childhood. And one of the characters is gay and the other is asexual. The movie kind of explores how the world treats them in these non-traditional roles, as well as how their sexuality has been affected through trauma. Mm-hmm. I did a class with the CHID professor Chandan Reddy called Queer Futures, and a lot of the readings for this class I'm pulling from that class. There's a reading on sexual abuse and queerness that hopefully people will read, or I can lecture on a little bit. Yeah.
And what made you want to do a deep dive into that topic?
So the other media sources that we're looking at in the class, it's going to be a video game called Night in the Woods, and then a play called BFF, and an album / just a selection of songs from Mitski, the musical artist.
Okay.
I think I mostly love all of these pieces of media, and I was how can I run a focus group about these pieces of media? And so I kind of was looking for common threads. We learned about the coming of age, or in German it's Bildungsroman structure, in which someone while coming of age steps out of cultural norms, and the end of the story or the resolution of the story is stepping back into those norms.
Yeah.
And I noticed throughout all of these sources that I really liked, there was no stepping back into the norms, and there was a lot more ambiguity in the story. So I wanted to look at that a little bit closer.
And what conversations are you hoping to have in this focus group?
I'm hoping I don't want to lead the conversations too much. I'm really curious to see what other people have to say once they kind of get to experience the media themselves. And I'm hoping, I think it deals with quite heavy topics, a lot of the material, and I'm hoping that we can kind of unpack it in a way in which we can find joy in queerness, as well as kind of working through the way that society can work against it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Please tell me about the inclusion of Mitski.
Mitski.
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, I think it's funny that there's Mitski on UW's official My Plan thing now, the word, I've done that, and you know what, that's an accomplishment in and of itself. But so it's more focusing on the queer themes within the music than the actually kind of diving into Mitski's personal psychology or something. But
okay.
Yeah.
So it's more of a literary analysis, per se.
Yes, definitely going to print out lyric sheets, highlight them, color on them, kind of see what's going on. Yeah, I'm excited.
And Mysterious Skin, I appreciate that choice. Yeah, it's a classic.
Yeah, it is a classic. It's tough, and I definitely ran it by Professor Reddy before putting it on the syllabus, but yeah, he was go for it, so I'm going for it. Yeah.
Please tell me more about any sort of incorporation from the Queer Futures class that you took.
Yeah, for sure. We actually didn't read this source for Queer Futures, but I've looked at it on my own, and we talked about it a little bit in Queer Futures. It's Jack Halberstam's The Queer Art of Failure.
Okay.
And that's kind of part of where, looking at queer joy can come in, too, is the thesis of the book is kind of, viewing failure to adhere to, whatever, quote-unquote, successes under current systems of oppression as a win, basically a personal win, and finding space to celebrate failure and see it as a queering of the world we live in. So I definitely want to bring that theory in as kind of an optimistic foundation for looking at these sources. A lot of what we talked about in that class as it was about futures was time, what we called liberal temporality, and kind of how queerness can exist as a liminal space a bit as a way to kind of fight that liberal temporality. And I think a lot of the like quote unquote failure to come of age or to come back into this role of taking on what society wants you to take on is like very much where all of these characters find themselves in their stories.
That is very dense.
Yeah, I credit Professor Reddy for most of this.
No, that's fascinating because I think I've definitely heard that. I could probably find some examples in my own personal life as to what that is.
Yeah.
Honestly, the only thing that comes to mind is a movie that came out last year that no one saw, Bros.
What? Tell me about Bros.
No? Okay. It was like marketed as the first like big budget R-rated comedy that featured two gay men, right? Like that's how it was marketed. But like the actual like a story of it, the meat of it was very banal. It conformed to a lot of traditional U.S. family norms, like the main character's monogamous, very typical relationship kind of going through that. Not much queering in the film besides just having two gay male leads and, you know, doing typical gay men stuff that is usually found in movies as a stereotypical thing. They go to clubs, etc.
Right.
The movie didn't do that well. And the main actor said that, you know, oh, it's because no one went to the film because straight people don't go to films, to these movies. And it's just like, well, yeah, it's a gay movie. Like, I wouldn't expect, like, a straight audience for it. And, you know, there's a lot of queer people in the U.S.
Right.
So it's just like, I think a good majority of them just didn't go to your movie because they just didn't want to see two, like, gay men. Because that does conform to, like, I don't know, an accepted norm, more or less than other queer identities, I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is kind of like touching on one of the questions like I want to ask in the group too, which is like you can't really tell a story with a conventional structure that is like you can't tell a queer story with a conventional structure and really have it work.
Totally.
In the sense of like it'll be like as you've described, like it's like queer people enacting straight norms, or you're like uncomfortable with the structure of the story. And I think the stories that I've picked, like especially Mysterious Skin, maybe some of the Mitski, but yeah, like they're uncomfortable and there's no resolution in the way that there kind of can be. And the resolution in my eyes is like we need abolition of these systems that make queer people suffering all the time.
Yeah.
So yeah, I want to like definitely use it as a space to explore like how to break away from enacting queerness under straight norms, but also like we don't have to be miserable all the time. I really want to explore like that aspect of it too.
Oh, that's fascinating. I'm sure Chandan has a lot more to say on this, given how much I know. He likes to think about this stuff. But the queer experience is kind of gross.
Yeah.
No,
it's gross. Yeah. It's uncomfortable. It can be embarrassing.
Yeah.
Like all of these things. Yeah. And I think even just having a space to like talk about it. And I think for me, like I'm someone who I just really like media, different like types of storytelling.
Yeah.
So maybe this is more personal, but I think like being able to like identify with some of these characters and their stories and their arcs, I'm like, this makes even like I don't know, being able to project yourself onto a character and then love that character is like almost kind of accepting your own queerness in a way. Like, yeah, so yeah.
Have you ever seen the films by John Cameron Mitchell?
I don't think I have.
Hedwig and the Angry Inch.
Oh, okay. I've heard this was on Broadway maybe too, right?
Yeah. It became a musical on Broadway afterwards with Neil Patrick Harris. He also did another movie that I really like called Short Bus. Won't touch too deeply on that since it is one of the most hardcore movies ever made. But Hedwig kind of fits to what we're talking about right now, where it's just kind of seeing the very traumatic, darkly funny life of a trans woman transitioning, but like, you know, from multiple cultural lens, from, you know, living in another country where that was not only is strongly prohibited but dangerous to like actually come out to,
right?
In comparison to like U.S. and all that. But still, I like watching the movie. The way I feel about it was, I'd rather have this and all its gnarly portrayals of what it means to come to terms with yourself than have a very basic movie that just kind of fills the quota of what it means to have a story.
Yeah, well, it feels like kind of like a cultural gaslighting of like, we're trying to depict the queer experience for you with these stories of queer people in straight like narrative structures, and it just like, I don't know. I remember like being in high school and Love, Simon came out, and I didn't even see it, but I know a lot of my friends were like, it's so great, I wish this is what could happen to me. And it's kind of like, maybe it can, but also like, how queer is this story? Like, it seems like it's a story that could be a straight story, but it's a, you know, gay story, and that's like not realistic to so many people's experiences. And
if you're not a particular white man.
Yeah, exactly. And there's that aspect of it too, which I've tried to pick sources that are not entirely like white upper class people who, you know, have privilege like outside of like being queer.
Totally.
Yeah, like I know Night in the Woods specifically, it's like, it's my favorite game ever, and I'm very excited.
Please tell me about it.
Yeah, I will. So it's about like this little gang of anthropomorphic guys. They're so cute, and I love them. So one of them, the main character, is named May, and that's who you play as. Yeah. And she's recently dropped out of college and come home to her hometown, which is in the Rust Belt. So like probably, I think, somewhere in western Pennsylvania, in like an old mining town. And it looks at like this group of like 4 queer friends and how they're dealing with like American capitalism, just totally like betraying their entire town, and what it's like to like not only exist under this structure of capitalism, but then also to be queer in this setting where like I guess it deals with how to be queer in settings where other people are also lacking the privilege to like understand queerness as well as maybe we can, like in an academic institution or something. Ooh. Yeah, so it's and it also deals with like a lot of mental health themes and kind of like existential themes that have to do with queerness, and I love it so much. I think I'm gonna find YouTube playthroughs so people don't have to like buy the game and play through it if they don't want to, but I would highly recommend playing it through. Is
it on Switch? I have a Switch.
It's on Steam.
Okay.
Yeah, so anyone with the laptop, and it's only like $10, so.
Okay, I'll look into it.
Yeah.
But everything you're saying reminds me of more films that I think are probably more relevant into thinking about queerness than other films. Tangerine comes to mind.
Oh, I've wanted to see that. That director also did the Florida Project, right?
Correct,
I've seen the Florida Project. I want to see Tangerine. I haven't seen it yet.
Both very good movies. Tangerine is such a depressing film about transgender black sex workers in South LA. And I just love how they did not shy away from all their daily troubles, and somehow, and this isn't a spoiler, this because I think it comes out of left field, somehow have a somewhat sweet ending to it. Like, despite all this crap that queer people have to go through, in particular in this movie, probably people very low on the totem pole. You know, they still try to find moments of like clarity and just peace, which I think is a bit more captivating in understanding people's story than. I don't want to go on a rant because this is just
totally.
You're
also,
the guest.
Feel free to go on a rant. I'm so into it.
Well, I like what you said about like the way we think about queerness in the academic institute is very different than you know once you're out in the world. And I know that's a controversial statement to say, out in the world. It's just like, well, this is the real world.
There's lots of variations of real world.
There's layers. Yeah, it's the way I'm socialized in this environment. Very different than I'm socialized when I'm out and about on a Saturday evening.
Right.
But it's just, I think a lot of academics tend to want to, especially when talking about queerness, come off more as though they're saying something profound about how the world can't change for the better. rather than, talk about current issues and how we could use that to our advantage.
Right.
In understanding people now.
Yes.
Instead of just speculating in very broad terms.
Right. Yeah. I think there's a lot of, at least in limited queer studies classes I've been in, there's a lot of post-structuralism and kind of, which is, I think, helpful of being okay, we're looking at all these structures and they're all the problem and we're not the problem and this is why everything feels wrong. It's because these structures exist. But then it's also there isn't so much focus on okay, so the structures need to be gone. The structures will not be gone overnight. So how do we exist as queer people today and tomorrow and next week? And, slowly, I guess, it's a hard question. And I think a lot of times in queer narratives, some of the best ways that can be executed is in a traditional setting, it's there's a stasis and then there's an intrusion, and that intrusion is the conflict and you have to get back to the way things were. And I almost think in queer stories it's it starts with conflict and throughout the story you kind of try to find the peace, which will be interesting to look at. Maybe a little bit it's hard to think about, I think, but
these are very touchy subjects that I think a lot of people are very scared to have an opinion on.
Yeah.
I would just like to say this is a safe space for you to test thoughts and whatnot. I am not here to judge. I'm here to just help facilitate how you're going to approach your focus group.
Yeah.
Because, there's a lot of ways you could go, especially nowadays. Speaking on video games, you could talk about that video game, but also talk about, Celeste or something, which is, also pretty big in queer.
I've heard of Celeste. My partner really likes Celeste, but I forget exactly what it is. Will you summarize a bit?
Hard platformer. Okay. Where the main character is a trans woman.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
Really cute. I have it. I haven't played it yet.
Okay, gotcha. Well, I also want to play it, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, no. I feel video games too, representation in video games, I'm not good at them, and I only have a computer. So I haven't played a ton, but I know with The Last of Us coming out recently, there's queer representation in that, and there's trans representation in the second game, and that was one of the things I actually looked at in the class with Professor Reddy was The Last of Us, I think, is very much a story that's a straight narrative with queer characters in it, and I'm trying to maybe even in the focus group we can look at stories like that and be what makes queer stories kind of corrupted by straightness, and what queer stories can be told as queer stories, and how do they look different. Yeah, I really will welcome I'll say this for everyone listening, one of the reasons I want to run this focus group is for people to throw queer media at me that I can consume that I didn't know about. So I really want people to bring their own ideas of the failed coming of age or the queer coming of age story into the room. And I think instead of kind of doing any final project or something, I kind of just want to have an open mic for people to be we talked about these themes throughout the focus group, and here's a piece of media I really like that I think these themes apply to and stuff, and we can all share more stories together.
Okay, well, I want to ask a personal question. Feel free to decline.
Okay.
Are you queer, and if so, how would you define your queer identity?
Yeah, I am queer. I identify as queer. I identify as non-binary, and generally, if someone is what's your sexuality? I'm I'm queer.
Fair.
Yeah. So that's definitely what I would be bringing into the room. I also think anyone can bring anything into the room, and as long as they're willing to look at queerness and talk about queerness and attempt to understand queerness, that's totally fine too.
Well, I guess I want to know more, how does that get actualized in your person or in your interests, et cetera, et cetera? Was there a turning point? You don't have to answer any of these questions.
No,
just
totally.
Pick one, but I don't know, this is something I like to ask because I think about pronouns quite a bit. Are you what pronouns do you use?
Yeah.
Let's start with that.
I use they, them, or she, her.
Okay.
That's just I'm most comfortable with they, them, but also she, her is fine. And I think sometimes something people assume, and I'm that's okay as long as I also use they, them. I think pronouns are helpful tools in making spaces safer for queer people. I also think they're proof that our language is set up in a really problematic way that is kind of not accommodating of queer people. And I think that applies to how we use the language as well as how the language like actually is. I think it's interesting that like looking at a lot of like indigenous languages, there aren't gendered pronouns, and kind of thinking about like how different systems have come up with languages and how those reflect culture. That's not at all about myself, though.
No, I mean, I think about this, too, because I think there's been a lot of discourse as of late as queer studies continues that, like, oh, pronouns aren't as important as other things, such as, like, action being taken to make people's lives better. And, look, sure, that's an argument, and that's totally valid, and to some degree, I agree with that. But, like, also, I think on not even like a queer level, but just on a personal human identity level, it's kind of like nice and a little bit fun to have like all these different variants of how you choose to present yourself.
Yeah, I think it's true. I think like any option, like kind of, yeah, I think queerness, a lot of it is self-determination.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think like, honestly, this is maybe a hot take for the Chid podcast. I feel like the claims of like you need to have dysphoria to really have an identity. You need to have a dysphoria about the identity you've been assigned. Like, I think that's really reflective of a society that's like making people feel awful about who they are.
Sure.
And I think like queerness is like truly just about expressing yourself, taking control of your own like narrative, and kind of separating yourself from oppressive systems that are like against queerness in a way.
Yeah.
And I think in that sense, like pronouns are super helpful because you can, you know, self-determine how other people refer to you.
Yeah.
And kind of snowballs from there.
I actually don't think that's a hot take. Appreciate that you said that with a straight face to a trans person. It's complicated, right? Like, yeah, like, I mean, they're all just words. If you look at the history of the term gender dysphoria, there is like a lot of like not chill medical stuff behind all that.
Yeah.
And, you know, if we have to be honest with ourselves, all gender dysphoria means is that you're not comfortable with how your body looks at a certain point.
Right.
And I think to some degree a lot of people are like that, whether they're trans, queer or not. It's just like, yeah, and I think for the most part it is used to more other people than anything.
Yeah. It's also gatekeepy. Okay. Like, it's like you can't be queer if you're happy with yourself, almost.
Sure.
And like not necessarily that's not necessarily from the queer community, but it's from like people gatekeeping like hormone therapy unless you're like miserable for like a certain period of time, or you're diagnosed as miserable in your own body by a doctor. And it's like, if people want hormone therapy to affirm their gender, they shouldn't have to be diagnosed like as miserable by a doctor to access that. Like it yeah. I know, like, studying in Scandinavian studies too, like Sweden, I believe, like, if you wanted to medically transition, you had to be sterilized until 2013.
Yep.
Yeah, and it's just like, wow, the more you pull it apart, the more everything is just set up to be anti-queer, and it really sucks.
Gosh, I'm having a lot of thoughts right now.
But you get to edit the podcast, so take your time.
I think within the queer community itself, not including any external factors, which is really hard. I think there is a lot of confusion as to how to go about socializing everyone within that space. And I say this being one of the weirder members, I would say, on a list of terminologies, trans, femme, non-binary. In my third year of transitioning, you know, I'm in this weird bubble of I don't think people know how to talk to me sometimes. And I think there is some times, and I won't say maybe even an expectation, but a feeling from other people who aren't transitioning that I'm like them to some degree. Like, oh, you are also not fitting within the norm of woman-man. You are just like me. In which case I'm like, I'm going to be doing this for like 20 years.
Yeah.
At some point, I'm going to probably look more woman than a lot of other people.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I feel like that's where there's kind of room for like looking at material conditions and how those affect people, in addition to like, okay, we're all in the queer community. We're not gatekeeping the queer community, but also like how much privilege do you have in respect to like someone who's medically transitioning? And, you know, I know like myself, like, there's discourse around whether non-binary people are trans, and like I personally like don't say I'm trans in the sense of like I have the privilege of someone who like could really easily be like perceived as cis, especially by people who are transphobic.
Sure.
And I think like just looking at like material conditions of how people are treated and how people kind of like fit into the structures we're unfortunately under is like important and sometimes ignored in discourse because we're trying to not gatekeep who's queer and who isn't. But yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating. Oh, I have a lot of personal experience there. One, let's go back to the medical system. I'm currently trying to get a facial reconstruction surgery. I've had to go through 4 therapist appointments before they were like, oh yeah, it seems like you want it. It's like, I've been transitioning for 3 years. What made you think I was going to question anything?
Yeah, in four sessions.
It's just like, see, that's frustrating. Like, why do I have to go through that? Material aspect, also a thing. I don't look as much as I want to look at the moment because I only have so much money I could spend each month.
Exactly.
And I would love if I could have all my facial hair removed. Very expensive. One, the upfront costs per session is more than I'm willing to pay on a regular basis. And 2, even though I do have insurance, the reimbursement for my pay of it takes 3 months.
Yeah.
Which is not fair.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, it's demotivating me from actually doing all of this.
Right.
Yeah.
No, totally. And that's, another thing to look at is like class and how does class affect queerness, and how are we, especially like, as we talked about before, in an academic setting, which is like largely, you know, probably more privileged than like somewhere like where Night in the Woods is set. People have more access to this like education, but also like, how are we judging how are we judging people's queerness based on like what they are able to access, I think is something that's important to look at. And how people can kind of, I think like going back to language, it's also an access thing and a class thing. And like, if you don't have access to learning language, then you like maybe can't verbalize your queerness in the way that more privileged people can, and like, again, not gatekeeping that from people who don't have access to education. Also, about like facial feminization surgery, one of the conversations we had in the Queer Futures class that comes up is in a group we were kind of talking about people who get like plastic surgery, like nose jobs and stuff, and we're like, in a way, this is kind of gender affirming for like people's femininity.
Totally, yeah.
And why is this approached totally differently than like a facial feminization surgery? Like, it's interesting to see how like people who are cis affirm their genders as well, and like how I think how that like interacts with queerness and maybe not queerness.
Ooh, that's a great thought. Gosh, I would love to talk more about this. Do you have more perspective on this? Anything that you remember from class?
It was kind of a digression from the larger conversation we were having. I think it's just like the larger conversation of like how can people like experience queerness and affirming that queerness while also like kind of acknowledging or being critical of like systems of like Eurocentric beauty standards, and like aesthetics is definitely part of that.
Yes, that's where I wanted to go into. Lovely. I mean, gosh, I don't know where to start with this. This is
it's loaded, yeah.
Yeah. I guess I want to ask you. Do you think you have an aesthetic in regards to how you actualize your non-binariness to the world or to yourself? Yeah,
I think I am someone who thinks it's really fun to perform gender, which I have friends who are also non-binary who are exactly the opposite, and they're like, I want to look androgynous every day. I don't want to be perceived as having a gender. And for me, I'm like, I want to perform, like, I like to feel sneaky. I'm like, I'm going to wear a dress today. Everyone's going to think I'm a woman, and I'm not. And it's like a little secret. Which, I think that's like maybe, yeah, there's just so much like room for personal, I think, expression like within queerness, which is cool. I definitely like, there are things like shaving your armpits or your legs that I'm like, I'm not going to do this. Not necessarily because I'm non-binary, but as a personal choice. But I think that can be read sometimes as more androgynous too. So it's like, yeah. And it's interesting to see how the aesthetics I'm choosing play into queerness versus like not queerness and why I'm making those decisions.
Well, also in your own personal life. At least for me, I found like my own aesthetic, how I portray myself to the outside world, influences like who I'm friends with as well.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Totally, because like I feel like that with tattoos especially. I'm like, I see a cool tattoo on someone, I'm like, I want to be friends with them. So then I'm like, now I want cool tattoos so people want to be friends with me. Like there's very much, I think, a culture of being able to identify people as queer from their aesthetics.
Totally.
And that's like, I feel like a double-edged sword, because on one hand you're like, I think they're so cool and now we can connect on this like thing that we both like think is cool, this aesthetic, but also consumerism and capitalism and like we're paying to like buy these clothes and this like hair dye and all of these things, and like how are we playing into capitalism with this? So yeah, it goes both ways.
It goes both ways. I've heard that same argument when it comes to makeup. The thing is, like, when it comes to that, it's just... maybe I'm very American, and I'm going to profess it with that. But going to other countries and visiting other places and just being aware of, like, fashion, they don't care as much as we do.
Yeah. No, I think it's fun to care. I think it's fun to look cool and like...
That's what I'm saying, yeah.
Look at little like mood boards and be like, ooh, I like this little vibe. Like cultivating these vibes. Like it's definitely a communication thing, and it's definitely, I think, a big part of the queer community is its aesthetics. And I'm not saying they're inherently problematic, but I'd be curious to see how that would look not under like consumerist capitalism.
Unfortunately, there's not a lot of good examples in the world, since most countries are very oppressive.
Yeah. I have noticed, like, a lot of queer aesthetics use, like, knitwear, like, crochet, and, like, patchwork, and, like, these things that have kind of a DIY ethic, which I think is really cool. Like, yeah, like, I feel like definitely I crochet, and when I, like, crochet little hats, I'm like, these are such, like... You know, I don't know, I feel gender affirming when I'm wearing my little beanies that I crocheted. And I'm like, why is me crocheting this queer? Maybe it's because I'm making it and I'm not buying it. I don't know. Or it's just fun.
I feel like we're about to have a therapy session.
Yeah, no, we're like, everything you believe is wrong and queerness is suffering, but also you have to make it happy. Yeah, bring in a happy note.
Yeah, just on a final note that being queer is compromise, I would say. Yeah, and I say that reluctantly, but I'm also, I guess, somewhat fine with it at the moment.
Okay, can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I can't present as my, I don't want to say as my true self, but sometimes I'm in an environment and I'm like, I'm very aware of like the people around me, who's here, and which way should I act to where it's like the most beneficial for me and for everyone here. So it won't be such a deterrent atmosphere. Like I've only recently gotten comfortable in speaking about my transness openly within the office here, for example.
Right.
That took I've been here for 2 years.
Yeah.
It took 2 years.
Yeah.
That's a long time. And it shouldn't be like that. But I would also say that like I think that time was necessary for people to see me as not just as a trans person who complains a lot about the world around them.
Right.
Even though I am valid, even though my criticisms are founded, to some degree, I have to play the game in order to succeed. Yeah. And that's frustrating, but the other way to approach it is socially alienating myself, and I don't want to do that again. Right. And I want life to be chill as much as I can be. So I guess that's what I mean by compromise. Yeah. It's like, especially like if I'm going to like a concert or something, right? Depending on like which concert I go to, it's just like dress down. dress down. That's better for me. Even at like trans-friendly spaces. I went to a 100 Gex concert recently.
How was that?
I've seen them. I'm assuming you know who they are.
Yes.
Okay. I've seen them 4 times. They're one of the reasons I feel, Laura List, one of the reasons why I think I found out I was trans.
Okay.
Yeah, I went to, this is a side note, I can't believe I'm talking 100 Gex right now.
It's okay, you can edit it out if you want to.
No, it's okay, it's okay. The first concert I went to them, I feel like it changed me a little bit, and Laura Les held my hand during the concert. Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah. I also went to 100 Gex after show. I used to live in LA, so this was really easy.
Oh, okay.
After show, where I was in the mosh pit with Dorian Electra. Yeah. These are things I just like to mention every once in a while.
No, keep this in the podcast. Like, people need to know.
No, I'm flexing. Yeah, but even like at that concert that I went to, like I was not expecting like the strong male presence. Like, and not even like just male presence, but like aggro with male presence.
Yeah.
And it's just like interesting. Like in my mind, in my world, I was like, this is a queer band.
Right.
At the very least, I expect it to be a very dominant queer like space. No, it was more like a just punk space.
Yeah. There's dang straight people everywhere. What can you do?
That's fascinating to me. That's like they just ignored this person's transness in my mind.
Yeah.
I think that was actually very eye-opening for me. It was super relevant to the conversation. Even in queer spaces, I have to put up a front, don't I?
Yeah. Totally. Yeah.
But yeah, let's end on a happy note. What are you most excited for in the next coming weeks? Summer, spring, blah blah blah.
Oh man. I am going to Portland to visit my sister and my grandma for my grandma's birthday in a couple weeks. Very excited for that.
Nice.
What about you?
What about me? I'm going to Europe in the summer.
Oh, that's exciting. What countries?
Portugal and Spain.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so should be fun. Yeah, need to get out of the country. I don't think I've been out of the country in quite a while. Yeah.
Passports are expensive. I studied abroad in Sweden like this past summer, and it's like $200 to get a passport. It's crazy. I
just changed my name, so the whole process for that's been super expensive.
Oh, I'm sure, yeah.
Yeah, but we're almost there. Anyways, thanks for coming on the podcast, Maya.
Yes, thank you for having me.
That was a great conversation. I was really happy with that.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Would you like to plug anything in?
Chid 496A, Fall Quarter 2023. Everyone should take it. Except there's only 11 spots, but, everyone should take it.
Yeah, just take it. Well, great. Thanks, Maya.
Yeah, thank you.